The night was unusually silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I remember it well, because that was the night everything changed in our little coastal town. It was a typical Friday, the air thick with the salt of the sea and the promise of the weekend. But for me, Lena, a local journalist with a nose for stories that others overlooked, it was the start of a descent into a darkness I hadn't anticipated. I was at my desk, the glow of my computer screen casting long shadows across the room, when the news came in. 2 teenagers, friends of friends, had vanished. Just like that, gone. No screams, no signs of a struggle, just an empty space where they should have been. Their parents were frantic, the police were baffled, and the town was buzzing with whispers. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple case of runaway kids. The forest outside town, where they were last seen, was no stranger to me. I'd explored it as a child, but even then, there was something about it that felt off, like it held secrets too deep for the light of day to reach. The next morning, the town was draped in a fog so thick you could almost taste the unease in the air. I stepped out of my small, cluttered apartment, the chill of the morning biting through my jacket. The usual sounds of the town were muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Walking down Main Street, I noticed the usual bustle was absent. The bakery, where I usually grabbed my morning coffee, was eerily quiet. Mrs. Thompson, the owner, gave me a nod, her face drawn with worry. "Morning, Lena," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You heard about those kids?" I nodded, taking my coffee. "Yeah, it's all anyone's talking about." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping even lower. "And now, Mr. Jenkins is missing too. His boat was found just off the shore last night, but no sign of him." My heart sank. Mr. Jenkins was a fixture in town, a man who knew every inch of the coastline. His disappearance was not just strange, it was impossible. I made my way to the police station, where the atmosphere was tense. Officer Daniels, an old acquaintance, looked up as I entered, his face weary. "Lena, what brings you here?" he asked, though he already knew. "I'm here about the disappearances. What's being done?" He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We're doing everything we can, but there's no trace, no leads. It's like they vanished into thin air." I pressed further. "And Mr. Jenkins?" That's even more baffling. His boat was found with the engine running, but no sign of struggle. It's like he just stepped off into the water and disappeared. The lack of evidence was both frustrating and terrifying. I left the station with more questions than answers, my mind racing. Back at the office, I started digging. The disappearances were too peculiar, too close together to be mere coincidence. I pulled up old articles, looking for any connection. That's when I stumbled upon a mention of a fire from 20 years ago. It was a small piece, buried in the archives, but it mentioned several deaths and an investigation that led nowhere. I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the realization that these events might be linked. I decided to visit the town's library where old records were kept. The librarian, Mrs. Carter, greeted me with a look of concern, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to overhear. "Hello, Lena, what brings you here today?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm looking into the old fire, the one from 20 years ago. Do you have any records on that?" Her face paled slightly, and she hesitated before nodding. "Yes, but why now?" I explained the recent disappearances, and she led me to a dusty corner of the library where old newspapers and town records were stored. As I sifted through yellowed pages, I found more than I bargained for. Articles detailed the fire, but what caught my eye were the names of the victims, some of whom were related to the currently missing individuals. The more I read, the clearer it became that the fire wasn't just an accident. There were whispers of arson, of a cover-up by local officials to protect their own. But the deeper I dug, the more resistance I encountered. The next day, I received a warning. A note slipped under my door with a single sentence. Stop digging or you'll disappear too. It was unsigned, but the threat was real. Yet it only fueled my determination. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions, not when lives were at stake. I met with an old friend, Tom, who had left town years ago but still had connections. He agreed to help, albeit reluctantly. Lena, this isn't just about old secrets. You're poking at something that could get you killed, he warned, his voice grave. Together, we traced the connections. Each missing person had either been at the fire or was related to someone who was. There was a pattern, a web of silence and fear spun by those in power. One evening, as we were piecing together the last bits of evidence, my phone rang. It was Officer Daniels, his voice strained. Lena, I need to see you. Now. It's urgent. We met at a secluded spot by the harbor, the wind howling around us. Daniels looked over his shoulder repeatedly, his usual calm demeanor replaced by palpable anxiety. I've been looking into this too, Lena. There's more than just a cover-up. There's a network. People who want to keep this buried at all costs. He handed me a USB drive. This is everything I could find, but you have to be careful. They're watching. Before I could ask more, his phone buzzed and he glanced at it, his face draining of color. I have to go. Keep this safe. And Lena, trust no one. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of the USB drive felt like a millstone around my neck. I knew I was close, but the danger was palpable. The next morning, I decided to confront one of the town's elders, Mr. Wallace, whose name appeared in the records related to the fire, hoping he could provide answers. His house was on the outskirts, an old, grand place that seemed to watch over the town with silent judgment. When I knocked, his wife answered, her face etched with worry. He's not here, she said, her voice trembling. He went out early this morning and hasn't come back. The pattern was repeating. Another disappearance, this time someone who might have had answers. I returned to my office, the USB drive now my only lead. As I plugged it in, my heart pounded. The files were encrypted, but Tom had given me a decryption key. What I found was chilling. Video footage from the night of the fire, showing local officials, including Mr. Wallace, discussing how to handle the aftermath, how to silence witnesses. But before I could make copies or even fully process what I was seeing, my door burst open. 2 men, faces obscured by masks, stormed in. They didn't speak, just moved with purpose. I tried to fight, to scream, but a cloth was pressed over my face and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in the forest, the same one where the teenagers had vanished. My head throbbed, and my hands were bound. Fear gripped me, not just for myself, but for the truth that was now within my grasp. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant call of a seabird, a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I struggled against the ropes, the rough bark of the tree scraping my skin, but they held firm. The men who had taken me were nowhere in sight, but I knew they were close, watching, waiting. My heart raced as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was not just a journalist anymore. I was a target, a loose end in a web of deceit that stretched back decades. In the dim light filtering through the dense canopy, I managed to maneuver my hands enough to reach into my pocket. The USB drive was still there, a small beacon of hope. I had to protect it, to get it out of this town, to someone who could expose the truth. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening with each passing minute. I remembered stories from my childhood, tales of the forest being haunted, not by ghosts, but by the secrets it kept. Now I was part of that story, trapped in its dark embrace. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A figure emerged from the undergrowth, not one of my captors, but someone I recognized, Officer Daniels. His uniform was disheveled, his face a mask of concern and fear. "Lena," he whispered, rushing to my side. His hands worked quickly to untie the ropes. I got your message. I've been looking for you. I was too shocked to speak at first, my mind reeling with questions. How did you find me? I finally managed. I've been following them, he said, his voice low and urgent. After I gave you the drive, I knew they'd come for you. I had to do something. He helped me to my feet, my legs shaky from the ordeal. We need to move now, he urged, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. As we stumbled through the undergrowth, the reality of what I had uncovered began to sink in. The video on the USB drive wasn't just evidence. It was a key to unraveling a conspiracy that had roots deep within the town's history. The officials in that video weren't just discussing a cover-up. They were orchestrating disappearances to keep their secrets buried. We need to get this to someone outside, I said, clutching the drive. Someone who can make it public. Daniels nodded, his face grim. I know someone, but we have to be fast. They're already cleaning up. The forest seemed to conspire against us, branches snagging at our clothes, the ground uneven underfoot. Every sound was a potential threat, every shadow a possible pursuer. We reached the edge of the forest, the town's lights a faint promise of safety,